Guys, another anime of the season, and this isekai is very promising, so leave a like and subscribe, and let's go to the video. And at the beginning of it all, a boy leaves his home and begins to train water magic, until suddenly, he is transported to a mysterious place. And then, he is approached by a being, who reassures him by saying that they are not in the afterlife. Having said that, he addresses the boy calling him Madara Ryo, and reveals that he ended up dying after a car accident. Upon hearing this, Ryo remembers this fact, and asks if that being is a god. At this, the creature claims to not be a god, but a simple angel. And as the conversation progresses, Ryo understands that he will be reincarnated in a new world. However, he still doesn't know exactly what he will do in this unknown place. In this, the angel leaves him free to do whatever he doesn't understand in this new world. After all, he wasn't assigned to the place to do anything. Upon hearing this, Ryo decides that he will live peacefully, seeking only happiness in this new world that he is about to go to. And in the meantime, the angel continues to explain to him how the world will work, and says that the place is called Phi and will have magic. However, only 20% of humans can use it. As for Ryo, the angel informs him that he has an aptitude for water magic, but since his goal is to have a peaceful life, the angel decides to send him to the Rondo Forest, and in addition, he will also grant Ryo a house and supplies for 2 months. And upon arriving at the place, Ryo finds a book on the table where there are several species of monsters, so that he can get to know better the creatures of the new world where he lives. And even realizing that the alphabet is different, Ryo is amazed to see that he is able to read those scriptures. And as for water magic, Ryo can master it without even saying anything, just by imagining the shape of the water in his hand. And although this speeds things up, Ryo is annoyed, as he liked having to repeat the intonations to make the water appear. And well, when trying to fill a bathtub with his water magic, Ryo realizes that he is only able to summon water at room temperature, something that leaves him disappointed. And when trying to make ice, Ryo faces a new problem, as he is also unable to control water magic to that extent. So, Ryo gets it into his head that he needs to find a way to figure out how to make ice, because that way, he will be able to use a magic like Ice Spear. So, Ryo tries a little harder, visualizing the water molecules molding themselves into a solid state. And finally, Ryo manages to freeze the water in the bucket completely, something that already makes him happy. But Ryo decides to go further, imagining a shape for that huge block of ice. Then, he takes a piece of ice in the shape of a sphere, and aims the ice at the sun, thus managing to retain the sun's heat in the ice to make a fire more easily. And as night falls, Ryo feels that he has had a very productive day in this new world, even though it was his first. And after thinking a little more, Ryo deduces that if he applies the same logic that made him able to have ice, he will also be able to produce hot water. With that said, he leaves the bath and heads to the kitchen to make something to eat. And during the meal, Ryo remembers that he will only have supplies for 2 months, which means he should start hunting soon. And since he only has a simple knife, Ryo deduces that he will need to master some attack magic. Therefore, to guarantee his safe and peaceful life, he will need to train to be able to defend himself. With that, Ryo leaves home and begins to train the water ball magic to be able to attack the possible enemies that appear in his path. And after practicing a little, Ryo manages to throw his first water ball and celebrates this new achievement. However, he realizes that this attack will still not be very effective, since it is very weak. At this, Ryo becomes slightly upset, but since he already senses that this could happen, he doesn't let himself get to shaken. Furthermore, Ryo remembers that he can use the water jet, an attack much more effective than the water ball he just launched. But when trying to use this new magic, Ryo shoots a weak jet of water from his hands, and then falls to the ground hopelessly. At this, he remembers the conversation he had with the angel about how to use magic, and the angel at the time only said that he should use his imagination. In this case, he needs to have a clear image of what he wants, and that way, the magic will be fired naturally. And as he trains, Ryo feels his magic improving a little, and then he manages to make hot water, using the opposite logic of ice production. And well, the next day, Ryo begins to train producing ice in the air, and although the process of this is very slow, he manages to succeed in his attempt to create ice in the air. And after passing this first stage, Ryo tries to throw the ice forward. However, the ice flies only a few meters away from him, and soon falls to the ground. At this point, Ryo realizes that all of his current abilities will be useless in a real battle context, since in addition to taking a long time to create ice, he still doesn't gain enough speed to generate damage, which makes his magic useless. And so, Ryo feels that he will need to train his magic more until he perfects it enough to be used in a battle context. After training exhaustively, Ryo falls to the ground feeling like he's about to faint, and then deduces that this is the feeling that occurs when one is low on mana. And after a few days, Ryo manages to at least generate ice in the air more quickly. However, he still can't throw it very far. And moving on, Ryo finds quartz in the forest, and decides to keep the ore to be able to make fire more easily. During his exploration, Ryo ends up finding a wild boar in the middle of the forest. The monster starts running towards him, threatening to attack him. Ryo is paralyzed, not knowing what to do. However, when the creature gets even closer to him, Ryo throws himself to the side on reflex, managing to get rid of the boar's attack. Then, Ryo summons a carpet of ice on the ground that goes towards the boar, making it slide and fall to the ground. At that moment, Ryo notices the monster coming towards him, and then he projects ice spears in the direction the boar is going, and thus he finally manages to kill it. And when he returns home, Ryo studies a little more about the smaller boars and discovers that this is the weakest species of monster in that world, something that leaves Ryo astonished, since he had to give everything he had to defeat the creature. And as he reads the book, he finds a page that talks about a certain dragon, which is capable of destroying an entire city without much difficulty. And right below the description of the monster, there is a note warning Ryo to run if he sees one of these dragons. But still on the same note, it is said that it is practically impossible to escape the dragon. Moving on to the next page, Ryo reads about demons, which in this case are a race of unknown origin, so the only thing they can do is pray to never come across a demon. And upon realizing how vast this new world can be, Ryo sighs in frustration, as he realizes that there is still a lot he needs to learn. And well, at another point, Ryo decides to go out for a bit to pick some fruit, when suddenly, he comes face to face with the giant hawk that starts attacking him. But during the fight, Ryo manages to deflect the monster's eye, forcing him to have to retreat from the fight. Seeing the creature in the distance, Ryo falls to the ground, sighing in relief, and notices that his longed-for peaceful life is getting further and further away. And when he gets up, he notices that he has lost track of the house where he was, but he continues on his way, believing he is in the right direction, until suddenly, he comes across a headless warrior in a river, but ignores him and continues on his way. A few days later, Ryo manages to launch a more powerful jet of water, this time, cutting a rock from end to end, and with that, Ryo feels for the first time that he is beginning to get used to how magic works in that world. And when he returns to the Headless Warrior, Ryo notices that it is a Dullahan, a being that the book does not mention, either because it is not a monster or because it is not a monster that would be in a beginner's book. And suddenly, the creature begins to attack Ryo with its sword until he falls to the ground exhausted. And although he is unable to defeat the Headless Warrior, Ryo says he has a purpose in always going to face that being. In this case, he feels that the Headless Warrior is willing to train him. And suddenly, during the training, Dullahan summons an ice sword and approaches Ryo, as if telling him to master that technique. And suddenly, the Dullahan hands the sword to Ryo and turns his back to leave. And another day, Ryo comes across the killer hawk from the other day again, and although the monster is darker, Ryo can recognize it by the cut it made in the creature's eye. From this, he deduces that the monster has evolved. And suddenly, the monster begins to attack him. In this, Ryo projects 10 ice shield barriers to protect him. However, the monster manages to destroy the barriers one by one, and then Ryo projects his ice spears to try to play against the enemy, but before he could do so, the hawk emits a sharp roar towards the ice, destroying them instantly. In this, Ryo deduces that this power of the monster allows him to annihilate any type of magic, a power that in the hands of a monster makes him totally up. And seeing himself with nothing much to do, Ryo finally decides to use the sword he received from the Headless Warrior, and then begins to face the monster on equal terms. But in the end, Ryo manages to defeat the hawk, which begins to writhe, showing that he has not accepted his defeat even though he has in fact lost that fight. And even though that monster was his enemy, Ryo believes that he was able to make good use of the encounter they had. After all, he used that fight to mature and become even stronger. Therefore, he thanks the monster for having given him this opportunity to grow. And when reflecting better on that situation, Ryo realizes that the monster evolved only with the intention of taking revenge on him later. Therefore, in respect for the pride that brought the hawk to that battle, Ryo promises to give a worthy end to his opponent. But as soon as he turns to leave, he comes across a dragon, which already scares him. However, Ryo is surprised by the fact that the dragon is able to talk. At this, the dragon asks to see the sword that Ryo carries at his waist, and upon looking at the equipment more closely, the dragon realizes that it is the sword of the king of the fairies, and says that if he received this gift, it is a sign that the king likes him very much. And well, during the conversation, the dragon hears someone calling him, and before leaving, he introduces himself as Lewin and says that they will soon see them. And in the meantime, the angel who granted Ryo to that world realizes that he ended up making a mistake, letting a secret characteristic pass in Ryo, and this characteristic is precisely eternal youth. When going to the sea to catch some fish, Ryo finds a half-broken boat there, and as he approaches, he discovers a man on the ground, apparently lifeless. But when he looks to the side, Ryo finds another man on the ground, but unlike the other, he is moving. At another point, the man wakes up in a room, surprised to find himself still alive. He goes outside and wonders where he is. As for Ryo, he goes to the young man and is relieved that he's awake. Upon seeing Ryo, the young man is startled, as he couldn't sense the slightest hint of his presence. Furthermore, he notices the boy's modest attire. However, he decides decides to leave that subject for another time. After all, he must first thank the boy for his help. He introduces himself as Abel and says he's very grateful to the boy for saving him. As for Ryo, he says he only brought him home, and furthermore, he feels sorry for Abel as he was the only one who survived the boat accident. Upon hearing this, Abel tells Ryo that he shouldn't worry about those guys. After all, they were smugglers. Upon hearing this, Ryo expresses interest in learning more, but Abel's stomach begins to growl, so they decide to go get something to eat for now. During the meal, Abel asks about the boy's clothes, and Ryo says he has nothing better to wear. After all, he hasn't found any thread or fabric to sew them yet. Abel reminds him that he can simply buy them ready-made. And as he says this, Abel remembers that the boy appears to be very humble, so it's clear he wouldn't have enough money to buy his own clothes. Abel feels he's just offended the person who saved his life, and he's apprehensive about this potentially offensive comment. However, Ryo responds normally, saying that the place they're in doesn't even have people or cities, so he has nowhere to buy clothes, leaving him to make do with what he has. Hearing this, Abel deduces that the meat he's eating was obtained by Ryo through hunting, and that, by the way, it was made using the small knife that's right next to him. To this, Ryo explains that he uses the knife more for self-defense or cleaning than for anything else. After all, he uses water magic to hunt and do various other things. Upon seeing this, Abel is amazed by the boy and informs him that even in the central province, a super busy place, only about half of the population is able to use magic, so seeing a boy in such a distant place being able to use magic is something that amazes him a lot. Furthermore, Abel says that he himself is incapable of using magic. As for Ryo, he remembers that Miguel had said that the number of people capable of using magic was actually 20%, not half, but he keeps this information off the record. At this point, Abel remembers something and asks Ryo to go with him to the coast so he can confirm what he just thought. On the way, Abel continues to ponder Ryo's magic and asks if he doesn't need to use a staff. To this, Ryo says he doesn't even have one. Hearing this, Abel deduces that he at least had a staff before, but lost it and was unable to acquire another due to his extreme poverty. Realizing he's just said something stupid, Abel starts to blame himself for making such senseless comments. He tries to correct this mistake by ordering Ryo to stay behind him, promising he'll defend them if any monsters emerge. Upon hearing this, Ryo tells him not to worry, but Abel insists, saying that being protected at all times will hurt his ego. And well, when they reach the slope, they notice that the bodies of the smugglers have all disappeared from this. Ryo deduces that they have been eaten or carried away by the sea. As they talk, Abel notices the boy being too formal with him and asks Ryo to stop treating him with such respect. After all, he's the one who was saved there, and so he believes he owes him all that respect. Upon hearing this, Ryo decides to treat him as he asks. Well, after searching the entire boat, Abel says he couldn't find what he was looking for. Ryo asks what he plans to do for now, and Abel says he'll meet his friends in the city of Lune. Hearing that strange name, Ryo says he's never heard of that place, but believes he should head north. With that, Abel thinks a little more, and then invites Ryo to go on this trip with him. But upon hearing this sudden proposal, the boy is confused, but Abel explains things better, and says he's actually hiring Ryo to go on a mission with him. In this case, the boy must help him find Lune, as Abel doesn't even know where he is. And after thinking a little more, Ryo accepts the job offer and offers to be Abel's guide. However, he asks them to leave the next day. After all, Ryo still needs to prepare for this trip. As night falls, Ryo says he's going out to find a certain someone. He then meets the Headless Swordsman, who informs him that he'll be away from the Rondo Forest for a while. He raises his sword and says he'll fight more seriously than usual. After the fight, Ryo prepares to leave, but before he leaves, he receives a cloak from the Headless Swordsman. The next day, Ryo leaves home, ready to continue his journey. But as he walks a few steps away from the house, Ryo turns to look at his home one last time before leaving. As they delve deeper into the forest, they encounter a giant boar. Abel tells Ryo to step aside, as he will deal with the enemy alone. Ryo takes down the enemy with a single strike using a combat skill. Seeing this, Ryo is impressed and asks what a combat skill is. Hearing this, Abel remembers that mages don't actually use such techniques during combat, and then explains that combat skills are techniques used by sword hinos and other weapon wielders, unlike mages, who use only magic to face their enemies. As they continue on, they encounter the lizard folk. Abel decides to turn around to avoid facing the monsters, but as soon as they turn their backs on the creatures, Ryo notices the lizards approaching. Hearing this, Abel realizes he has no choice but to fight them. As for Ryo, he decides to use his magic to aid in the fight. Seeing that he can cast magic even without a staff, Abel is impressed and asks what spell he just used. Ryo tells him he just cast a spell called Icicle Spear. With that said, Abel calls him to continue their journey. However, Ryo asks him to wait a bit, and so he uses his magic to generate a glass of water. After all, they must always stay hydrated while walking through the forest. And as they continue on, Abel shows the neighborhood a coin from his kingdom, something that impresses Ryo. After all, this is the first time he's seen money in his entire life. Abel explains a little more about money to Ryo, explaining that each nation designs its own coins. And when talking about some kingdoms close, Tobal mentions the name Dabui to Ryo, giving him a strange look. Upon seeing this, Abel asks if something's wrong, and Ryo then says that the name is very cheesy, and since it's the name of a nation, it should have been thought through more carefully. After all, Ryo would never want to say he came from a place called Dabui. And well, moving on, Abel notices the place is devoid of many trees, which gives them a wider view. And suddenly, the rocks in the place begin to be levitated and thrown at them. Seeing this, Abel realizes they're not, in fact, in the middle of the stone golem's nest. He attacks one of the golems, opening a hole in its belly, but the monster quickly regenerates. As for Ryo, he decides to try a different move. He erects a 10-layer ice wall and slams it against the ground. Seeing this, Abel is shocked and asks what the boy just did. Ryo then says he just crushed men with his 10-layer ice barrier, so he'll use the same tactic with the other golem. With only one golem left, Abel notices that it can't move, and Ryo deduces that they absorb the energy from the ground, but now that it's down, the golems can't do anything. Furthermore, Ryo notices that there's a magic stone attached to the golem, and although he wanted to collect the stones from the other golems as well, Ryo realizes that he's left them in a condition that's practically impossible to collect. Later, they encounter a behemoth, but soon after, a group of wyverns approaches the location. Upon seeing this scene, Abel deduces that Behemoth will be easily defeated, but he manages to defeat the group of wyverns with just a roar. Later, Abel and Ryo talk about dungeons, and Ryo expresses a keen interest in visiting them someday. Hearing this, Abel says he's in luck. After all, the only dungeon in the central provinces is in the city they're heading to. And well, at dawn, they continue their journey until suddenly, they sense an enemy presence approaching. A giant bird approaches them and threatens to attack. However, Ryo and Abel throw meat into the sky, distracting the bird and causing it to fly away. And although they manage to survive easily, Abel says that the monster from before had a very powerful and imposing presence. And as for Ryo, he assures that in a battle against the monster, they would have been killed. After all, humans were not meant to fight enemies of that size. And as for that place, Abel says that there are rumors of strange things happening there, as there have been many sightings of Behemoth and other dangerous monsters in the area. As for Ryo, he suggests that the wyverns from before came from the north, and so they encounter the creatures there. Upon seeing them, Ryo says they'll need to fight. After all, even though they're very strong, there's no way to prevent that confrontation from occurring. Ryo freezes the enemies to the ground using his ice magic, and then Abel collects the magic stone the monster dropped and says he's surprised at how easily they defeated a wyvern. However, reinforcements from the monsters arrive shortly afterward to confront them. And upon discovering how to take down wyverns, Ryo suggests they want to have more fun with these creatures, but Abel puts the brakes on him, saying it's best to never encounter any of these monsters, even if they know how to take them down. As they head north, Abel wonders where they are. Ryo deduces they're in the Dabui Empire, but Abel explains that the Dabui Empire is actually located in the north of the kingdom, so it's unlikely they've arrived there yet. Upon hearing this, Ryo still seems to be struggling with the kingdom's peculiar name, as he's relieved they're not in Dabui. Hearing this, Abel is at a loss to understand Ryo's enmity toward the kingdom, especially for the reason he's already mentioned. The boy then says that Abel has it all wrong because he doesn't hate the Dabui Empire, as Abel thinks, in fact, he just dislikes the name. Well, with that said, Ryo notices a road ahead of them, which appears to lead from east to west. Upon discovering this, Abel notices some familiar mountains behind him, and then says that if they continue along that road, they will reach a city called Kailati. Hearing this, Ryo is relieved, as he will finally be able to rest in a city after so long. At this, Abel notices the boy's mood change very quickly, as just seconds ago, he was eager to go after and kill more wyverns. Seeing Abel trying to catch him in a contradiction, Ryo makes it clear that he intends to do both, each in its own time. As for Abel, he only agrees with Ryo's version of wanting to relax. After all, Abel is already tired of adventures for now. Besides, he says the food in Kailati is really good, so he advises Ryo to stop thinking about battles for a bit and try the local cuisine. Well, moving on, they find a tavern and decide to stop for a bite to eat. Abel begins to talk to Ryo about these adventurers' guilds, who in turn becomes curious about the subject. Abel suggests that the boy join a guild as soon as possible, as a guild card can even serve as his ID, which in turn will save them from having to pay taxes when they go sightseeing in other cities. Having said that, Abel reminds him that he acted as Ryo's guarantor, paying him a silver. Hearing this, the boy becomes suspicious and deduces that Abel did this as a way to collect something from him later, such as demanding slave labor from Ryo. However, Abel makes it clear that he's not the jerk Ryo paints him as. Upon hearing this, the boy apologizes for having suspected something of that nature about him. As for Abel, he goes on to explain a bit more about how adventurers' guilds work, saying that the guild is responsible for purchasing magic stones and materials from monsters at a high price. While they talk, a local employee brings them their food, which in this case is curry, the famous dish from reincarnation reincarnation stories. Ryo then remembers that the protagonist of an isekai of this type usually travels a long way before finally being able to recreate that dish. However, seeing that it already exists in Phi leaves Ryo speechless. And after finishing the first plate of curry, Ryo asks the waitress for another round, and then he asks Abel if they have curry in Lune too. And Abel in turn answers yes, and says he was happy to see that Ryo liked the dish. Well, the next day, the boy continues talking about the curry, saying it was fantastic. At this, Abel is incredulous that he liked the food so much. And as for Ryo, he asks Abel not to hide any more delicious dishes that exist in that city. Therefore, Ryo starts asking Abel to tell him the best desserts in the city. However, Abel continues on his way and says that he will take care of that matter later. And well, as they continue on their way, they arrive in Lune, Abel's hometown. On the way to the guild, Abel explains to Ryo how guild rankings work, saying that Ryo will start at rank F, the lowest rank. Once they arrive at the guild, everyone is shocked to see Abel alive, as he had been missing for several days. As for Ryo, he notices Abel crowded with people, so he decides to go outside so as not to disturb their moment among friends. However, as he walks through town, Ryo bumps into a random elf who, upon seeing him, tells him that the outfit he's wearing once belonged to the Fairy King. Hearing this, Ryo is speechless, but the elf says she was just wandering around in his clothes and says the Fairy King must be very fond of him since he gave her one of his cloaks. With that, the elf apologizes for not being able to speak properly as she's in a hurry. As for Ryo, he continues to stare at her, not understanding anything she's saying. Suddenly, Abel goes outside and finds Ryo to introduce him to his friends. He explains the whole story he had with Ryo, from when the boy saved him to the moment he returned to Lune. Abel asks his friends to treat Ryo well, too. After all, he'll be registering with that guild as an adventurer. At another point, Abel takes Ryo to the reception to register with the guild, and asks that the boy be registered at level D as his endorsement. Upon hearing this, the receptionist is surprised, as no one from the Scarlet Sword has ever endorsed another person in this way. However, Abel says the boy is truly valuable and therefore worthy of working with him. But before officially making Ryo Abel's endorsement, the girl reminds him that Ryo will need to pass some tests to determine the boy's strength level. Upon hearing this, Abel says he was waiting for the guild master to talk about this and a few other things. Seeing that he intends to speak with the master, the girl asks Abel to wait until she goes to get him. After a few minutes, Abel finally comes face to face with the master after so long. Before getting to the main topic, Abel apologizes for having worried everyone about his disappearance. As for the master, he says he had already assumed the worst from the start when he learned of his disappearance. With that said, he notices Ryo's presence and asks who that boy is. Abel introduces him as the man who saved his life, and upon discovering this, the guild master formally introduces himself to the boy, claiming to be Huma Glass, and then thanks Ryo for saving Abel's life. Upon hearing this, Roy again tries to play it down, saying he was simply in the right place at the right time, and therefore believes he's not worthy of all this credit. Moving on to the main topic of the meeting, Abel says he was considering registering Roy as his endorsement, but upon hearing this, Hugh says the boy will still need to pass a test to certify his level. At this, Abel reassures him, saying that the boy is actually even stronger than he is. With this, Abel throws on the table some of the magic stones they collected on the way to Lune. Upon seeing them, Hugh recognizes that they are wind elemental magic stones, but he can't analyze anything beyond that. But upon further thought, Hugh realizes that those stones are from wyverns, and noticing that they have an absurd amount of stones. Hugh says that to achieve all that, they would have Tothan having defeated an entire army of these monsters, something that is humanly impossible, even more so for two adventurers. As for Abel, he says these wyverns were hunted south of the Evil Mountains, a place adventurers usually avoid, as most who set foot there never returned alive, since Abel and Ryo managed to return from that place. Abel believes this is more than enough proof of the boy's strength, and as for Hugh, he accepts this evidence as proof. And well, during the meeting, the room is invaded by other friends of Abel who come to see him. Just then, Roy is taken to the records room, where he is approached by Nina, who begins asking him a series of questions. And upon hearing about the dungeons during the interview, Roy asks Nina to put his name on the next course the teams will take in one of Lune's dungeons. And well, upon completing the registration, Nina hands Roy a card and then leaves the room. Meanwhile, Hugh feels as if a weight has been lifted from his shoulders. Now that Abel is back, the morbid atmosphere that had gripped the guild has completely disappeared. So, he decides to spread the word that Abel is alive. As for Roy, he's taken to the place where he'll receive his first payment for escorting Abel around the city. Abel also says he intends to buy Roy new clothes and a staff. However, upon hearing this expression, the boy, unsure of what exactly a staff is, explains that it's the item mages typically use to cast magic. But upon hearing this, Roy says he's never needed any accessories to cast his spells. After all, the only accessory he uses is his sword when he needs to face an enemy at close range. However, looking the boy over, Abel notices he doesn't have a sword. However, Roy shows him his blade, which in this case is just a small knife, which to Abel can't be considered a sword. At another point, Roy finds himself walking alone through the city, and when he stops to think about the coincidences between that world and Earth. Roy refuses to believe that all these signs are just coincidences. And well, as night falls, Ryo, Abel, and some other friends celebrate his return to Lune by getting drunk. The next day, Nina accompanies Ryo to his room. Upon arriving, they encounter some more boys. Nina introduces Ryo to them, and the boys introduce themselves as Nils and Edo. As soon as Nina leaves, Nils reveals his crush on her. However, Edo reminds him that the guild receptionists are full of suitors, so he advises Nils to give up on her. Suddenly, Nina returns to the room to bring another adventurer. The boy introduces himself as Amon. Meanwhile, Abel talks to his friends and tells them everything Roy did during the fight against the Wyverns. However, Linz is skeptical, as the only one capable of doing everything Abel is describing is the Infernal Mudge, a Mudge who was able to burn 1,000 Imperial soldiers with a single magical attack. As for one of the girls, she begins to worry that Roy might side with the Empire at some point, but Abel assures her that this will never happen. After all, Roy has already said the Empire's name. Moral of the story, don't go to an empire where it has a bad name. Otherwise, someone else can go to an empire with a good name and leave you screwed. Well, my friends, leave the like, so we can see the continuation, and until the next episode, bye, and subscribe, huh?